Let's sit back and go through this history of Chinese cinematic representation of the United States. Before I go into specific details, I want to make some general observations. What started me in this research is this, to me, it's a striking contrast. On the one hand, for 20th century Chinese history, you probably could only think of 3 countries that have played a major role in shaping the course of modern Chinese history: Japan, Russia, and the United States. And for the second half century, of course, the United States has replaced Japan. And yet you don't find as nearly many cinematic images of the United States. I mean, certainly we get a lot of representation of Japan, that goes without saying. And so that's one of the things that sparked interest in me. I wanted to look into this. And secondly, we just got a glimpse of that. Hollywood, over the years, has produced enormous amount of China pictures. In fact, that's how it was referred to back in the 1930s. We only saw some of the recent examples, and Hollywood didn't start making China pictures in the last few decades. It goes all the way back. And I started wondering why the Chinese filmmakers have not made nearly comparable numbers of films about the US. And finally, it's the contrast between the overwhelming number of articles, books in print media about the United States and the scarcity in cinematic representation. So that's what got me interested in this project. Generally speaking, the history of Chinese cinematic representation of America can be divided into 3 periods, roughly coinciding with China's political history: the pre-49 Republican period, the Cold War years, and the post-Mao period. There is a general shift that I want to mention at the outset of my talk. If you look at this entire history, you would notice there's a shift from positive image of the United States during the Republican era to the negative image of the Cold War years, as you would have expected. And then in the post-Mao era, the last few decades, you see a return to a generally positive image with more complexities and nuances. So I will start with a very broad sketch of this history by talking about the pre-49 period first. For the first time, an American face appeared on Chinese screen was in a film called 滑稽大王游护记. What is interesting about this film is that this Charlie Chaplin character is not the real Charlie. He is played by a British national living in Shanghai. But the film was enormously popular, so the studio, real Chaplin, did visit China 10 years later. But that film was followed very quickly, within a few months, by another film about Harold Lloyd, also played by a Caucasian living in China. There were 2 Chinese films from the 1920s making references to America, but without directly showing America visually. The first one is called 春闺梦里人, and the other one is called Weijinsu. In both cases, the references to the United States are positive. In My Sorrow, 春闺梦里人, an American-educated Chinese student returns to war-torn China and dies there trying to help the country with what he learned in the United States. America is credited as the source of his idealism, innocence, and moral integrity, all of which are contrasted with corruption, violence, decadence that he encounters there. Here's another still from this film. The other Chinese film made in 1926 called Weijinsu. This one is even more interesting. Another returnee from the United States to China. In this case, what is interesting is that he succeeded in implementing a democratic reform. Actually, he runs for a mayoral election in China, and he finally wins. Figure that, a mayoral election in 20th China. But again, United States is credited as the source of the blueprint for his political reform in China. In yet another film from 1920s, you finally get an image of American, although the two Americans in this film are played by Russians, white Russians living in Shanghai. You see in this film an American doctor and a nurse. They appear only very briefly, but they are cast in positive roles. Another still from this film. And then, of course, as we all know, China entered World War II, and Chinese film industry moved inland. They stopped making any films, except a few short documentaries. Not until after World War II, a government-controlled studio produced a major production called Shengcheng Ji. Here you have an American missionary cast in the central role, played by a Chinese actor. What is interesting to note about this American character is that he's all positive. You know, he's the lead character. He offers spiritual guidance to the Chinese. He runs a school that educates the Chinese kids. And he also has medical knowledge and cures the sick and provides for the needy. He's really represented as the personification of Jesus Christ. Here's the Chinese female star in this film. But the story is quite straightforward. Father King shelters Chinese resistance fighters in his church and provides sanctuary for the Chinese villagers. In the end, he is murdered by a Japanese agent, but not before he finally finishing a letter appealing to peace-loving people to help the Chinese. Here's a cover of the special bulletin devoted to this film for publicity purpose. Here's another one. But interestingly, this film was not very well received, despite the enormous resources devoted to this film. At the time, the government had a strong interest in promoting this film because, as many of you know, the nationalist government was supported by the United States. But the film was a box office disaster. And in fact, several things happened around the time that help us understand why this film didn't do very well. In fact, many officials from the government later on also came out to denounce the film. As I mentioned here, it has to do with some of the circumstances, the civil war between the nationalists and the communists, the behavior of American GIs in China that quickly soured the relationship, and the Sino-American Commercial Treaty that was signed. So in a way, maybe it has a lot to do with the timing. I mean, the film was put into production before all of those things happened, but 6 months later when the film was completed, you have all of those things bursting on the scene. For the post-war, for the Cold War years, I want to mention two examples. One is called 有一家人, made in 1951. The other one is called 美国之窗. Interestingly, a family also cast an American missionary in the central role. It's a reverse of Secret City that I just mentioned minutes earlier. He's the opposite of Father King. in this case, Gao Shenfu, brainwashes the Chinese youth to like America, and he's portrayed as a hypocrite, and he collaborates with the authorities to persecute his students who have a sympathy for the communists. And a year later, another film was made about the United States, and this time you get a chance to see life in America on Chinese screen. But it's interesting to note that in this film, the filmmakers make a very deliberate distinction between good, ordinary Americans and the bad, evil Wall Street journalists. The working class Americans care about each other, they show class solidarity. And the story is about an unemployed worker named Kent who wants to commit suicide. But the capitalist wants to use this opportunity to advertise products. So he manages to persuade Kent to give him the exclusive right to broadcast his suicide, so that everybody want to put their products. The cigarette makers want him to have his last cigarette before he died to smoke his brand, and the shoemakers, the suit makers. So they, I will show a clip to give you some idea what this film is like. How does this work? Oh. This is towards the end. The union workers voice the capitalist plan, and you notice actually there is African American in this group. They persuade Ken to give up his plan to jump from the building and join the union.
谢谢你的一切帮助，谢谢你把我从自杀中拯救出来，让我回到千千万万的人群中来。再晚几分钟，我就要成了肉酱，我们怎么能让你那么做呢？哎呀，哎呀，到了没有快点！
Capitalists going down.
你要活下去，参加我们的队伍，活下去。对了，活下去，看，加入我们人民的队伍，勇敢的活下去。
Doing once is not enough, going down. The workers going up.
Ken, 你看，远远的我们可以看见另外一个国家放出来的光芒。
That
这
country
是
is
我们
Soviet
美国人
Union.
民最后希望的曙光，也是全世界人民最后希望的曙光。Ken, 勇敢的活下去，为了将来能过好日子，坚决的斗争。
Notice the music. Now, for the post-Mao years, the first film made in the post-Mao years with some reference to the United States is a film called Lucha Lin. Interestingly, it reminds us, I mean, again, America is not directly, not visually shown, but it's alluded to. In this case, a Chinese American returns to China in search for cultural roots, who falls in love there, but America is alluded to in a very positive way. In the interest of time, I'm gonna jump to another film clip. In this film, it's also about the downed American pilot during World War II period, who is saved by the Chinese. Right now, he is in Japanese captivity. The flashback shows life in America. This American character is played by a Chinese actor. This is how Chinese imagine life in America is like. The film was made in 1980. good idea. Want to go back to the slide? Okay. Another film from 1980, the early days, is based on the real, a real character, Helen Snow. Many of you probably are familiar with this name. She worked as a journalist in 1930s China and wrote about the communists in very sympathetic fashion. I will just quickly go through this. To me, the most representative work from the post-Mao era is a film called 黄河决恋, in which a real American is cast in the central role, played by Paul Kersey. Some of the most noticeable changes in this film is an interracial romance. Normally, if that happens at all, it's usually the Chinese man taking the foreign girl, but not in this case. Very quickly, I will skip this part. I'll play one last clip before I finish. As I would argue that Chinese view of America is inseparable from the view they have of themselves, as you would see in this next clip. This is after the American pilot is saved by this Chinese boy the boy pulls him up from the cliff. And at this point, there's an interaction between the two. Okay. 'Of course, the boy cannot read that. But he is fascinated by something else that Owen has. Camera, symbol of modernity.
Camera.
Likewise, Owen is fascinated by the lucky charm the Chinese boy is hanging in front of his chest, which is a symbol of Chinese tradition. But watch for the next 30 seconds.
We are done.
The lucky charm did not save him. I guess I will just leave there.